They say that people venture into the wilderness to escape, to run from the sorrows and burdens of a civilized life. One goes deep into the forest to forget, but perhaps few of us have ever paused to ask a simple question. Does the forest itself ever forget its own sorrows? Do the tragedies, the pain that has soaked into the soil and seeped into the grain of every tree, simply fade with time? Or do they lie dormant, waiting? The story I am about to tell you may be a cold answer to that question. It was on a late winter day, with snow piled more than a meter deep, that Rescue Team Bravo finally reached Ranger Station Delta, a small, remote cabin lost amidst the thousands of square kilometers of the northern Maine National Park. They arrived after the station had fallen unnervingly silent for 72 straight hours. The scene inside was one of both stillness and strangeness. A thin veneer of frost covered everything, from the work desk and the stacks of files to the half-empty coffee mug, its contents now congealed into a solid block of ice. There was no sign of a struggle. No footprints led out into the storm. The door was locked from the inside. Everything seemed to be in its place, lacking only one thing: life. And yet, amidst the dead silence, a single sound persisted. A faint but incessant sound emanating from the communications radio on the desk. It was not a voice, nor a call for help. It was merely the static of an open channel, a steady hiss that sounded like the last, tired breath of a dying man in a world already dead. Ranger Frank Miller, the seasoned veteran responsible for Station Delta, had vanished. Vanished as if he had never existed at all. Where had he gone? What had happened during those 3 days of isolation in the blizzard? No one knew for sure. The only clue they found was the audio log recovered from the station's hard drive. To understand his mysterious disappearance, perhaps we must do what the rescue team did that day. We must go back in time to listen to the final sounds recorded from Ranger Station Delta, to listen to the story of Frank Miller. The first audio log begins at 1800 hours. The sound quality is sharp, capturing not only the voice that would soon speak, but the subtle life of the cabin itself. The low, guttural hum of the generator, the gentle hiss of the propane heater, and the vast, pressing silence that lay just outside the insulated walls. Frank Miller's hands, thick with calluses from a life spent outdoors, moved with an unthinking economy. He tapped the glass face of the barometer, his eyes registering the steady pressure. He checked the battery levels on the emergency console, his lips forming a thin, tight line of approval. Every action was a small ritual, a piece of a larger liturgy of survival he had practiced for years. He was a man who found a fragile sense of order in procedure, a bulwark against the chaos that he knew the wilderness and life could unleash at any moment. He leaned towards the microphone, the warm metal cool against his chapped lips. When he spoke, his voice was a perfect monotone, scrubbed clean of all emotion. It was the voice of officialdom, of reports filed and duties discharged. This is Ranger Miller, Station Delta, commencing standard evening report for Tuesday, October 7th. Sky is overcast, visibility approximately 2 miles and decreasing. Wind is out of the northwest at 15 knots, gusts up to 25. Temperature holding at -12 Celsius and is expected to drop overnight. All equipment is operational. Nothing further to report at this time. Station Delta, out. He clicked off the transmitter and leaned back in his chair. The squeak of the old wood loud in the sudden quiet. The man on the radio was competent, controlled, and unremarkable. But the man who now stared out the reinforced window into the gathering twilight was someone else entirely. The omniscient narrator, the one who hears the thoughts behind the words, knew the truth of him. Frank did not see the stark beauty of the snow-laden pines that so many poets wrote about. He saw only a vast, unending ocean of black and white, a void that perfectly mirrored the one inside his own chest. The silence of the forest was not peaceful to him. It was accusatory. It was the same hollow silence that had filled his car on a snowy road years ago. It was the silence of a house that was once filled with laughter. This post, this assignment, to the most isolated station in the entire park system, had not been a promotion, it had been a request, a self-imposed exile. He had come here seeking not solitude, but a penance that felt as cold and empty as his own soul. The weariness that settled on his shoulders had less to do with the long hours and more to do with the long years. It was a fatigue of the spirit, a deep and abiding exhaustion from which he suspected there was no real rest. He took a sip of lukewarm coffee from his thermos, the bitterness a familiar, almost welcome sensation. Outside, the wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound, and Frank felt no different from the skeletal trees, bracing themselves for another long, dark night. The click of the transmitter switching off was a release. In the utter quiet that followed, the man known as Ranger Miller seemed to recede, and in his place sat Frank, his broad shoulders, held so rigidly just moments before, slumped forward, and the carefully maintained mask of professional detachment dissolved, revealing the raw, weathered face of a man worn down by more than just the elements. He ran a hand over his tired face, the rasp of his stubble loud in the stillness of the cabin. He stared out the window, but he no longer saw the endless sea of trees. His focus blurred, and in the hypnotic dance of the falling snowflakes, a single memory began to surface. It came not as a conscious thought, but as a ghost rising through deep water. A name that was both a wound and a prayer, Lily. With a slow, deliberate movement that spoke of a long-practiced ritual, he pushed himself up from the chair and knelt beside his old canvas duffel bag. It was a relic from another life, a container of ghosts he couldn't bring himself to throw away. He didn't need to look. His hand knew what it was searching for. His fingers brushed past the wool, sweater, and the worn paperback before closing around the familiar shape of a small, wooden box. He brought it back to the desk and placed it gently in the pool of light from the desk lamp. It was a child's music box, made of some dark, scarred wood, faded painted roses, their petals chipped and worn, entwined around the edges. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, his thumb tracing the worn-down latch. Then, with a faint click, he opened it. It wasn't a beautiful sound. Years of use had warped the tiny metal teeth of the comb, and the delicate cylinder turned with a slight labored groan. The melody that emerged was hesitant, tinny, and painfully off-key, a fragile ghost of the lullaby it was meant to be. Hush, little baby. The notes struggled into the cold air, each one a tiny, shimmering shard of a forgotten warmth. As the music played, Frank's eyes closed, and for a fleeting instant, the image of a small hand with paint on its fingers reaching for the box flashed behind his eyelids. He saw a smile that could have outshone the sundae. The melody completed its clumsy cycle and fell silent. The mechanism whirred for a second longer and then stopped. The sigh that escaped Frank's lips was a ragged, hollow thing, the sound of a man exhaling a grief too vast to be contained. It was the sound of a soul collapsing under the weight of its own history. And the silence that followed was different. The quiet of the cabin before had simply been an absence of noise. This silence was a presence. It was heavy, suffocating, pressing in from all sides. It drank the warmth from the heater and filled the small space with the palpable weight of loss. The cabin was no longer a shelter. It felt like a tomb, a memorial to a life that was no more. In the oppressive quiet, Frank Miller sat alone, a man haunted long before anything in the woods ever took notice of him. An hour passed, maybe more. The music box was back in the duffel bag, the ghost of his melody tucked away with it. Frank had forced himself back into the rhythm of his duties, the familiar procedure, a shield against the rising tide of memory. The logbook was open on the desk, and he was preparing for the 2,000 hours report, his pen scratching notations about the increasing wind speed. The radio was on, as always, filling the cabin with its familiar, chaotic hiss, the sound of a million distant sparks, a comforting white noise he had long ago learned to ignore. But then, the sound began to change. It was not a sudden shift, but a gradual, subtle coalescing. The random frying bacon crackle started to thin, to smooth out as if some unseen hand were slowly turning a cosmic dial. Underneath the fading hiss, something else took shape. A new sound, low and resonant, began to emerge from the speaker. Frank stopped writing. He tilted his head, his pen hovering over the page. He frowned. The sound was a slow, rhythmic pulse. It had a deep bass note, a hollow quality that seemed to vibrate in the very air of the cabin. It was a sound of immense scale, a slow, deliberate cadence. WSS, a pause of 2, maybe 3 seconds. HH hey, WWW dub. It was not mechanical. It was not the wind, which he could hear shrieking around the eaves of the cabin. This was something else. This sounded, to the most primal and ancient part of his mind, like breathing, like the deep, steady respiration of some colossal, sleeping creature. His professional instincts took over. He pushed his chair back and approached the humming console. He rapped the metal casing sharply with his knuckles, the old serviceman's tap, but the sound continued, uninterrupted. He knelt, his cold fingers tracing the thick coaxial cable to the wall, checking that the connection was secure. It was. He toggled a few switches, changed the frequency, and then changed it back. But the rhythmic pulse remained, a steady, patient heartbeat beneath the static. He stood up, crossing his arms and staring at the machine as if it were a wild animal that had wandered into his camp. His mind, trained to find logical causes for every effect, offered up a dozen explanations. Unusual atmospheric interference from the blizzard, the storm playing tricks on the ionosphere, a rare form of solar flare. He told himself it was just weather. It had to be. But his gut, an older and wiser instrument, was not convinced. There was an organic quality to the sound, a purposefulness in its rhythm that felt utterly alien to the chaos of a storm. It did not sound like weather. It sounded alive. A small, cold seed of unease was planted in the pit of his stomach. For the first time that night, Frank Miller felt like he might not be entirely alone. He stood there for a long time, listening. The rhythmic static continued its slow, patient pulse. A sound that defied every rational explanation he could muster. He tried to dismiss it, to file it away under unexplained atmospheric phenomena, and return to his logbook. Normalcy, he thought. Routine is the best defense. He turned away from the radio and went to the small counter to pour himself a fresh cup of coffee from his thermos. The simple, domestic act, a small rebellion against the growing strangeness. He needed the warmth, the familiar bitterness. He needed to feel grounded. He raised the steaming mug to his lips, his gaze fixed on the swirling snow outside the window. And it was then, as he listened to the heavy, breathing static in the background, that another sound bled through the frequency. It was not loud. It was a thin, metallic thread of sound, so faint he almost missed it, weaving itself through the heavy bass of the pulse. It was a melody, a warped, sickly, sweet tune that sounded as if it had traveled across an impossible distance to reach him. The notes were there, but they were wrong, stretched and slightly sharp, like a recording played at the wrong speed. It was a corrupted memory of a sound. It was a lullaby. "Hush, little baby, don't say a..." Frank froze. The coffee mug stopped an inch from his lips, his hand locked in place as if seized by a stroke. The steam from the coffee curled up into the frigid air, the only thing moving in the suddenly petrified silence of his world. His own breathing had ceased. His entire consciousness had narrowed to a single point, the speaker of the radio. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, swallowed once more by the slow, deep S of the breathing static. For a full 10 seconds, he didn't move. His mind scrambled for purchase, for a logical foothold in a situation that was rapidly becoming a sheer cliff face. Auditory pareidolia, a part of his brain supplied, the tendency to find patterns in random noise. You heard the music box earlier. Your brain is just filling in the blanks. It was a textbook explanation. It was perfectly sane, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the sub-zero air outside, that it was wrong. His hand trembled as he slammed the mug down on the counter, coffee sloshing over the side. He lunged for the microphone, fumbling the switch. His voice, when it came out, was strained and a little too loud. "Control, this is Delta. Come in. Control, I'm getting some significant signal bleed through on my end. Are you running a systems test? Over." He released the button and waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. The only reply was the continued, patient breathing from the speaker. No voice from a friendly dispatcher, not even normal static. The channel was dead silent, save for the impossible sound that now seemed to be listening right along with him. He let the microphone fall from his hand, where it swung on its coiled cord like a hanged man. He forced himself to take a breath. "It was an echo," he whispered to the empty room. "Just an echo in my head. A phantom." But the lie offered no comfort. It felt thin and brittle, a sheet of ice too weak to hold his weight. He was a man who had spent his life trusting his senses, the feel of the wind, the smell of rain, the sound of a branch breaking under a predator's foot, and his senses were telling him that the sound had not come from inside his head. It had come through that speaker. It had a physical presence in the room, and a piece of it still lingered in the air, a cold spot that his own grief had just answered to. Sleep was a distant country to which Frank could find no passage. He lay on the narrow cot in the corner of the cabin, the thin wool blanket pulled up to his chin, but his eyes remained wide open, staring into the oppressive darkness. Every attempt to drift off was thwarted by the sound from the main room. The slow, rhythmic pulse of the radio static was an inescapable presence, a monstrous lullaby that promised not rest, but vigilance. The silence between each breath was somehow worse, a held moment of anticipation that made every nerve in his body scream. After an hour of this futile struggle, he threw the blanket off. He couldn't lie here. To lie here was to be a sitting duck for his own thoughts, for the memory of that corrupted melody and the chilling, impossible voice. "An idle mind," his father used to say, "is the devil's workshop." Tonight, Frank's mind felt like a cathedral built in the devil's honor, and he needed to find something, anything, to fill its echoing halls with mundane work. He lit a gas lantern, its hiss a welcome, normal sound, and turned his attention to the old metal storage cabinets at the back of the station. They were filled with the detritus of decades of lonely men, outdated maps, yellowed repair manuals, spare parts for equipment that had been decommissioned years ago. He busied himself with the pointless task of sorting them, the clank of metal and the rustle of old paper a welcome distraction. It was a fight against the spiraling dread, a desperate attempt to impose order on his small corner of the world while the universe outside seemed to be unraveling. He worked his way to the bottom cabinet and pulled down the last drawer. It wouldn't budge. It was stuck fast, sealed shut by rust or some slight warp in its frame. For a moment he was about to leave it, but a stubborn frustration took hold. Gritting his teeth, he found a pry bar in the toolkit, wedged it into the small gap, and put his weight into it. With a deafening screech of protesting metal, the drawer flew open, its contents spilling onto the dusty floor. Amidst the clutter of dried-out inkwells and rusty paper clips, one object lay apart from the rest. It was a book. It was a thick, leather-bound logbook, its dark green cover warped by years of damp and neglect. The spine was cracked, and the gilt lettering on the front was so faded he had to angle it in the lantern light to read the single embossed word, Hayes. He picked it up. It felt heavy, substantial. He blew a cloud of gray dust from the cover, the moles dancing like tiny spirits in the beam of his flashlight. He carried it back to the desk, the rhythmic breathing from the radio seeming to watch him with a newfound interest. He sat down, opened the brittle cover, and aimed the lonely beam of his flashlight onto the first yellowed page. The handwriting was neat, precise, the entries methodical. It began, as he expected, with weather reports and notes on animal sightings. For now, it was just the ordinary, dutiful record of another man who had once sat in this very chair, in this very same darkness. And Frank began to read. The first dozen pages were exactly what he expected. Meticulous records of snowfall, fuel consumption, and animal sightings. The neat, professional script of Ranger Hayes painted a picture of a man much like himself, dedicated and orderly. Frank found a strange, fleeting comfort in the routine nature of it all. But a growing sense of urgency made him impatient. This wasn't what he was looking for. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew it wasn't a list of maintenance checks from 5 years ago. His instincts, now honed to a razor's edge by the night's events, told him the answers, if there were any, would lie at the end of the story, not the beginning. He flipped past months, then years of entries. The paper grew softer, the ink slightly more faded, and then he saw it. The handwriting began to change. The transformation was stark. The neat, controlled script that filled the first half of the book devolved into a frantic, spidery scrawl. The letters grew jagged and sharp, pressed so hard into the page in places that the paper was nearly torn through. Sentences were crammed, running into each other without punctuation, as if the writer was terrified of lifting his pen, terrified of the silence between words. Frank felt a jolt of cold recognition. This was the handwriting of a man losing his grip. He stopped at the final, dated entry, his flashlight beam trembling slightly in his hand. He leaned closer, and his own voice, a dry and raspy whisper, read the desperate words aloud. November 14th. It's happening again. The sound. It's not just static anymore. There's a rhythm to it. God help me. It feels like the whole forest is listening. Frank paused, his throat tight. He swallowed hard and continued reading, the words feeling like poison on his tongue, hearing things again, not just in my head, through the radio. The forest. It feels like it's trying to talk through the radio, not with words, but with a pressure, a feeling. It gets stronger when the storms roll in, especially when the antenna is pointed toward the devil's jaw. That damned rock formation is pulling it in. I swear it is. His eyes scanned the final chilling lines, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Sometimes I hear a song, faint, distorted, a children's song. Frank slammed the book shut. The sound was like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet of the cabin. His own breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. He stared at the silent radio console on his desk, no longer seeing a piece of government equipment, but a malevolent altar, a conduit to something ancient and awake. The seed of unease that had been planted earlier had now erupted into a thorny vine of pure, undiluted fear, wrapping itself around his heart. This was the moment the floor fell out from under his carefully constructed reality. Coincidence was a shield, and that shield had just been shattered into 1,000 pieces. The breathing static, the lullaby. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't his grief playing tricks on him. It was real. It had happened before. He was not the first. And the chilling, unspoken truth that hung in the air was that the man who wrote those words, Ranger Hayes, was gone. Vanished from this very same station, leaving nothing behind but a desperate, terrifying warning. Frank felt a shock of icy water in his veins. His unease had curdled into genuine, mortal fear. Fear is a catalyst. It can paralyze a man, rooting him to the spot in mute terror, or it can galvanize him into action. For Frank Miller, a man whose entire life was defined by doing, by acting, there was never really a choice. The words in Hayes' logbook were not just a warning, they were a hypothesis, and his terror demanded he put it to the test. To sit and wait in the dark, listening to that impossible sound, was to surrender. To act was to fight back, even if it was a fight against the very laws of nature. A grim determination settled over his features, hardening his jaw. He looked from the logbook to the humming radio, and then to the heavy insulated door. He knew what he had to do. Pulling on his heavy parka and thick gloves, he unbolted the door and stepped out into a roaring, white chaos. The shock of the Arctic air was a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. The wind howled like a predator, driving snow into his face with the force of 1,000 needles. The world beyond his small circle of light from the doorway was a swirling vortex of black and white. He fought his way through the deepening drifts to the base of the antenna mast, a skeletal metal structure already caked in a thick layer of ice. He found the manual crank, its metal so cold it seemed to burn through the fabric of his gloves. With a grunt of exertion, he began to turn it. The gears protested with a high-pitched screech, but slowly, centimeter by centimeter, the large antenna array began to pivot on its icy axis. He didn't need a compass. He knew these woods, this sky, better than he knew himself. He turned the array away from the direction of the distant control station and pointed it directly east, towards the jagged, unseen peaks he knew were there, hidden in the storm of formation the old maps called the Devil's Jaw. He didn't wait to see if anything had changed. He scrambled back inside, slamming the door shut and bolting it against the raging storm. The roar of the wind was instantly muffled, and in the relative quiet of the cabin, he heard it. The effect was immediate and profound. The rhythmic static was no longer a subtle background pulse. It was loud. It filled the small room, a tangible presence that seemed to vibrate up through the soles of his boots. The sound was more defined now. No longer a smooth hiss, but a coarse, rasping texture, like air being dragged across ancient, stone vocal cords. The experiment had worked, and the confirmation was more terrifying than the uncertainty had been. All thoughts of sleep or escape vanished. Fear gave way to a feverish, obsessive need to understand. He fell into the chair before the radio, his face bathed in the eerie green glow of the frequency display. For the next hour, he was a man possessed. His hands flew across the console, twisting dials with a frantic precision, coaxing the signal, teasing the frequency. He was no longer just listening, he was hunting. He was hunched over the speaker, head tilted, eyes narrowed, trying to strip away the layers of static, trying to isolate the ghostly signal at the heart of that impossible, living breath. His hunt through the frequencies was a dead end. The signal was everywhere and nowhere at once, a ghost embedded in the very fabric of the airwaves. No amount of fine-tuning could isolate it. It was like trying to catch smoke with a net. Frustration and exhaustion began to gnaw at him, but the fear was a sharper-toothed animal. It would not let him rest. His gaze fell again upon Hayes' logbook, lying open on the desk. If he couldn't find the source of the signal in the present, perhaps he could find its pattern in the past, with a new, methodical purpose. He turned away from the radio. He pulled out the station's official archives, thick, heavy binders containing years of meteorological data and geological reports sent from the state survey. He placed Hayes' logbook on one side of the lantern and the official records on the other, the frantic, emotional scroll of the past facing the cold, objective data of history. His obsession had shifted from the radio dials to the stark numbers on the page. He began the slow, painstaking process of cross-referencing. His finger traced down the dates in Hayes' log, stopping at every entry that mentioned the strange sounds. September 8th, the breathing sound was back all night. Couldn't sleep. Frank's eyes flicked to the meteorological binder for the corresponding year. He found the date. His breath caught in his throat. The entry read, "Sudden atmospheric river event. Record low pressure system. Sustained winds of 60 miles per hour. A jolt, cold and electric, shot through him." It was a single data point. It could still be a coincidence. He forced himself to continue. October 22nd. Heard the whispers in the static again. Faint, but they were there. He checked the geological survey reports. October 22nd. Minor seismic activity detected. Epicenter 5 miles east of Devil's Jaw. Magnitude 2.1. A tremor so slight he wouldn't even have felt it, but the earth had shivered. One by one, he found them. Every single one of Hayes' anomalous audio events, without exception, corresponded perfectly with a significant natural disturbance. A violent electrical storm, a sudden polar vortex, an earth tremor. It was a one-to-one correlation, a terrifyingly consistent pattern. It was a formula. An immense release of natural energy plus the proximity of the Devil's Jaw equals the phenomena. Frank leaned back in his chair, the binders forgotten. He didn't need to read anymore. He could hear the evidence for himself in the shriek of the wind against the cabin walls, in the way the floorboards vibrated with the fury of the blizzard outside. He wasn't just in the middle of a storm. He was in the middle of a trigger event. The horrifying clarity of it settled upon him like a shroud. This wasn't random. This wasn't a haunting. This was a natural phenomenon, as predictable and as impersonal as an earthquake or a hurricane. The land itself was a machine, an ancient and poorly understood apparatus. The storm was a power source, and he, Frank Miller, was nothing more than a specimen trapped inside the machine as it was being switched on. The cold, hard data swirled in Frank's mind: pressure systems, seismic waves, atmospheric anomalies. But in the terrifying silence of his thoughts, it was a human voice that echoed the loudest. A memory pushed to the back of his mind for months, now surged forward with the force of a tidal wave. A trivial moment from the past that had suddenly become the most important thing he had ever heard. He was back in the warm, greasy air of the Northwood Diner, the last bastion of civilization before the park entrance. He remembered the smell of stale coffee and frying bacon, the feel of the cracked red vinyl of the booth, and the low murmur of the locals. They had been giving him advice, the new Ranger, a mix of good-natured warnings and tall tales. The conversation had inevitably turned to the jagged mountain range to the east. "You watch your radio out there, Ranger," a burly logger had said, pointing a fork at him. "Especially near the Devil's Jaw. That place is a radio trap." Swallow's signals hold. The others had nodded in agreement, each with their own story of a transmission lost, of a compass spinning wildly. Frank had listened politely, smiling. He'd heard a dozen such stories in his career. Every remote posting had its own local legend, its own boogeyman. He'd filed it away as quaint folklore, a scientific curiosity at best, likely caused by unusual magnetic iron deposits in the rock. But then he remembered the old man. He had been sitting alone at the counter, a man so weathered and ancient he seemed carved from the same gnarled timber as the forest itself. He hadn't been part of the conversation, just a silent fixture, staring into the black depths of his coffee mug. Without looking up, he had spoken, his voice a low, gravelly mumble that somehow cut through the diner's chatter. "It don't trap 'em." The loggers had quieted, glancing at the old man with a mixture of reverence and dismissal. The old man had taken a slow sip of his coffee before continuing. His words meant more for the ceramic mug than for anyone else in the room. "It don't trap 'em," he repeated. "It chews 'em up and spits 'em back out different." At the time, Frank had dismissed it as the ramblings of an old eccentric. Now, sitting in the cold, humming cabin, with the rhythmic breathing of the forest filling his ears, the old man's words were no longer folklore. They were a prophecy. It was a decoder ring for the nightmare he was now living. It didn't just swallow signals, it chewed them. It took them, broke them down, and reformed them into something else. It had taken the random energy of the storm, the faint radio waves from distant towns, and perhaps, most terrifyingly, the lingering psychic residue of his own grief left hanging in the air. It had chewed it all up and spat back a corrupted lullaby. It had spat back his daughter's voice. The cryptic warning had become a perfect, horrific explanation. And with that understanding, a new and more profound wave of terror washed over him. He was not just dealing with a natural phenomena. He was dealing with an intelligence, a hungry and transformative consciousness in the heart of the ancient land. The understanding offered no comfort, only a deeper, more profound sense of dread. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, forming a picture of such impossible horror that his mind struggled to accept it. And as if summoned by his terrible realization, the storm, which had been a menacing presence all evening, decided to truly arrive. It was a physical assault of sound and fury. The low howl of the wind escalated into a high-pitched, deafening shriek, the sound of a universe being torn apart at the seams. The small cabin groaned under the pressure, the timbers shuddering with each new gust. Frank, standing frozen in the middle of the room, could feel the vibrations through the thick soles of his boots. The world outside the window ceased to exist. It was no longer a landscape of trees and snow, but a blinding, featureless void, a solid wall of white that pressed against the glass, threatening to swallow the tiny outpost whole. Then, the lights flickered. Once, twice, The steady, warm hum of the generator sputtered, coughed, and died. Frank was plunged into a sudden, suffocating blackness. For a heart-stopping second, the only sensations were the roaring of the storm and the frantic pounding of his own blood in his ears. Then, with a loud click, the emergency battery system kicked in. The cabin was bathed in a sickly, greenish yellow glow from the 2 low wattage lamps on the walls. The familiar space was instantly transformed into something alien and threatening. Long, distorted shadows writhed and danced with every shudder of the building, making the small room feel like a cage full of restless phantoms. In this new, diminished world, the radio on the desk took on a terrible new significance. Just moments before, it had been the source of his terror, a mouthpiece for the malevolent intelligence of the forest. Now, with the power gone and the storm at its absolute peak, it was also his only link to the outside world, his only hope. The paradox was a cruel one. The very thing he feared was now his only lifeline. He stumbled to the desk, his hand closing around the cold plastic of the microphone. He keyed the transmitter, his training forcing a semblance of calm into his voice. "Control, this is Delta. Do you copy? I've lost main power. Reporting severe blizzard conditions. Visibility is 0. Requesting status update. Over." He released the button, straining to hear a human voice through the speaker. But his call was not met with the rhythmic breathing, nor the ghostly melody. Instead, the radio answered with an explosive, deafening roar. It was as if the fury of the storm itself had found its way into the wires, a chaotic sea of noise that drowned out all other frequencies. He tried again, shouting this time, but his words were instantly swallowed by the overwhelming static. His lifeline was cut. The radio was no longer a tool for communication. It had been fully claimed by the storm, another instrument for the chaos. He let the microphone slip from his fingers. He was not just miles from another human being, he was on another planet, a tiny, flickering speck of life in an ocean of roaring, indifferent power. He was, for the first time in his life, completely and utterly alone. He slumped in his chair, a man defeated. The roaring static was the sound of his own helplessness, a deafening confirmation that he was cut off from everything. There was nothing left to do. No procedure, no protocol, no action that could change his situation. He could only sit and wait for the storm to break him, or for the cabin to be torn apart around him, whichever came first. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the overwhelming noise and the crushing weight of his isolation. And then, it stopped. It wasn't a fade, but a clean, sudden severance. As if a switch had been flipped on a cosmic scale, the roaring sea of static vanished, leaving behind a silence so absolute it was a physical presence. It was a heavy, pressurized silence that made his ears pop, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very air from the room. The cabin still shuddered and groaned. The storm still shrieked outside, but from the radio, there was nothing. An unnatural, perfect void. Into this vacuum, a sound bloomed. It was not distorted or faint. It was not the breathing static or the corrupted melody. It was a voice, perfectly rendered, without a hint of interference. It was a sound of impossible clarity and purity, as if the speaker were standing right beside him in the dimly lit cabin. It was a sweet, innocent voice, the unblemished sound of childhood, a sound that had no place in this world of violent storms and deep-seated grief. It was a voice he knew better than his own name, a voice that was etched onto the very fabric of his soul. It was the voice of his daughter, Lily. "Daddy," the voice said, as clear and as perfect as a summer morning. "It's so cold out here. Please open the door." The words did not register in his mind as a sound to be interpreted. They struck him as a physical force. A shock wave slammed into his chest with the brutal impact of a fist, knocking the air from his lungs in a single, silent gasp. He recoiled, his chair scraping violently against the floorboards as he stumbled backward, away from the desk, away from that impossible, beloved voice. It was not the slow, aching grief he had carried for years, the heavy blanket that smothered his every waking moment. This was something new. This was a sharp, violent agony, a fresh amputation of the soul. It was the pain of the loss happening all over again, right now, in real time, but twisted into a monstrous, cruel mockery. He clutched at his chest, his mouth open in a silent scream, his lungs refusing to draw breath. The world narrowed to a single, agonizing point. The small, dark speaker of the radio, from which the voice of his dead child was asking to be let in from the cold. He was no longer a ranger. He was no longer a man fighting a storm. He was only a father, being exquisitely tortured by a ghost in a machine. The sweet, perfect voice of his daughter did not speak again. It did not need to. The single, impossible plea was left hanging in the suffocating silence of the cabin. A cruel hook baited with his deepest love, and Frank was caught upon it, gasping and bleeding from a wound he thought could never be reopened so violently. He stumbled, his back hitting the cold wall of the cabin, his legs trembling too much to hold his weight. He slid down to the floor, his mind a howling vortex of grief and disbelief. The silence held for a moment longer, a black, velvet canvas upon which the entity was about to paint its masterpiece of cruelty. Then, a new sound started to whisper from the radio speaker. It began subtly. So subtly, Frank almost didn't recognize it. It was the low, familiar rumble of an old engine, the specific, slightly off rhythm of the V8 in his 20-year-old Ford station wagon. He recognized the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of his worn windshield wipers struggling against the heavy snow. His eyes, wide with horror, stared at the radio. This was not a generic sound. This was a specific acoustic fingerprint pulled directly from his memory. Then came another sound, woven into the engine's drone, a tinny pop song from a decade ago, playing softly. And under that, the sound of a child humming along, slightly off-key. Lily, a choked, guttural sob escaped Frank's throat. No, not this. Anything but this. It was not a memory. A memory is a ghost that lives inside your own head. This wasn't broadcast. A high-fidelity replay of the last 5 minutes of his daughter's life piped into the room with perfect, malevolent clarity. He clamped his hands over his ears, a desperate, futile gesture. But the sounds were no longer just coming from the radio. They were everywhere, inside his skull, behind his eyes. The radio broadcast the sudden panic sound of his own voice. "Hold on, sweetie. The road's getting icy." Then came the screech. It was a high, tearing sound of rubber losing its final, desperate grip on a sheet of black ice. It was a sound of absolute loss of control, of physics delivering a death sentence. Frank screwed his eyes shut, but the images burst behind his eyelids, painted there by the audio cues. The world tilting, the horrifying, weightless moment before impact. It was followed by a cacophony of sickening, final noises. The percussive, deafening crunch of metal, a sound of a world being torn apart as the station wagon met the unyielding mass of an old oak tree. The deep, groaning groan of the chassis bending, of steel twisting into shapes it was never meant to hold. Then came the crystalline, explosive shatter of the windshield. A sound like a chandelier made of ice falling onto a stone floor. The pop music cut out. The humming stopped. The engine died. The broadcast ended with the one sound more terrible than all the others. The sudden, complete, and unnatural silence that followed. Frank was on the floor of the cabin, curled into a ball, his hands locked over his head as if to protect himself from a physical blow. The sounds that had haunted his nightmares for 5 long years had just been given a voice, broadcast into the real world, and the violation of it left him broken, a man trapped in the screeching, shattering wreckage of his own mind. The silence that followed the replay of the crash was not empty. It was thick with the ghost of violence, with the memory of shattered glass and twisted metal. Lying on the floor, Frank felt as if he were still in the wreckage, surrounded by a profound, echoing quiet that was more terrifying than the impact itself. This new silence was different from the one before. It was sterile, cold, and smelled of antiseptic and dread. He recognized it instantly. It was the silence of the hospital. Slowly, as if setting a new scene on its cruel stage, the entity began to introduce new sounds. First came the steady, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, a sound that promises life, but here only served as a metronome for his despair. Then, the distant, disembodied voice of a nurse over an intercom, the words unintelligible, but the tone flat and weary, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on the polished linoleum floor. Each sound was another brick in the wall of that terrible memory, rebuilding the hospital waiting room around him right there in the cabin. Frank pushed himself into a sitting position, his back against the wall, his arms wrapped around his head. He knew what was coming next. He had been dreading it in the deepest part of his soul for 5 years. And then it came. A voice, torn from the radio speaker. It was the voice of his ex-wife, Sarah. But it was not the voice he had loved, the one that laughed at his bad jokes and sent their daughter to sleep. This voice was an instrument of pure agony, shredded by a grief so profound it had been forged into a weapon. It was hoarse from screaming, brittle from crying. It began as a choked whisper, a sound of utter devastation. Our baby, oh God, Frank, our Lily, Frank, squeezed his eyes shut, tears streaming down his face. Sarah, I'm sorry, he whispered to the empty room, a useless, pathetic echo of the words he said that day. The voice on the radio seemed to hear him, to feed on his response. The grief in it curdled into a raw, untamed rage. Sorry? Sorry? It shrieked, the sound distorting the small speaker. This is your fault. It's all your fault. And as her scream reached its peak, it was cut short. In its place, the radio played a new sound, a sound of exquisite torture. It was the lullaby from the music box. But it was no longer the simple, off-key tune from the wooden box. The entity had taken it, corrupted it. It was slowed down, the notes dragging like they were being pulled through tar, a demented, mocking dirge. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. The profane melody played for a few bars, then cut out, replaced again by Sarah screaming. You were driving. You were supposed to keep her safe. You were driving. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird. The lullaby oozed from the speaker, the notes bending and warping sickeningly. The beautiful, precious memory of that song, a memory he had clung to like a holy relic, was being systematically defiled, turned into the soundtrack for his damnation. This was the entity's true genius. It didn't just replay his trauma. It actively participated in it, weaving his last remaining beautiful memory into the fabric of his ugliest one. He was no longer just a victim of a tragic accident. He was a defendant in a supernatural court. The voice from the radio was not just Sarah's. It was the voice of his own self-loathing given form, broadcasting the secret, terrible verdict he had passed on himself every single day for the past 5 years. And as the screaming and the demented lullaby washed over him, Frank Miller did not fight back. He simply endured the sentence. The assault ended as abruptly as it had begun. Sarah's screaming and the demented lullaby were cut off, leaving behind a ringing, hollow silence in the cabin. Frank remained on the floor, his body trembling in the aftermath, his cheek pressed against the cold, dusty floorboards. He felt scoured out, an empty vessel filled with nothing but the echoing phantoms of sound and guilt. The raw, violent emotion of the past hour had burned itself out, leaving in its place a profound and terrifying numbness. Slowly, mechanically, like a man moving in a dream, he pushed himself to his feet. His movements were stiff and robotic. The primal fear was still there, a cold stone in his gut. But another instinct was taking over now, the desperate human need to understand. Why? How? The questions beat against the inside of his skull. He stumbled back to the desk, his eyes ignoring the radio, the source of his torment. They were fixed on Hayes' logbook. He had dismissed the final entry as insanity. the ravings of a man whose isolation had shattered his mind. Now, in the chilling clarity of his own shattered reality, he knew that the final page was not a descent into madness, but a desperate attempt to map the geography of a nightmare. He flipped to the end, his fingers clumsy, and forced himself to read the words he had previously skimmed. Hayes' handwriting on this last page was a chaotic explosion of ink. Words were underlined 3-4 times. Exclamation points were stabbed into the paper. But beneath the panic, there was a terrifying, crystalline logic. Frank read the passage that had seemed so insane just hours before. "It's the rock," Hayes had written, the words nearly tearing through the page. It has to be the rock, the devil's jaw. It's not just a landmark, it's antenna, a receiver, but not for radio waves. It's a psychic amplifier for the whole damn forest. It takes what's already here and makes it loud. Frank's eyes scanned the next lines, his own experience providing the horrific context. "I thought it was a ghost at first, a single spirit, a lost child from one of the old legends. But it's not that simple. It's too cruel for that, too intelligent in how it hurts you. It's not a ghost, I think it's ALL of them, every last one." The final paragraph was the key. It was the madman's theory that was now the only truth that mattered. "The land here is old, older than any of us, and it has a long memory. Every tragedy, every lost hunter, every violent death, every moment of pure terror that has happened in these woods for 1,000 years, it hasn't just vanished. The forest absorbs it. The land remembers. The echoes of tragedy are soaked into the soil, into the trees, into the very rock itself. And when the storms come, when the earth shakes, the devil's jaw sings with all that pain. It broadcasts the echoes." Frank let the book fall from his hands. He finally understood. He was not being haunted by the ghost of his daughter. The thought, in a strange, perverse way, was a deep disappointment. A haunting implies a soul, a connection, something left to mourn. This was infinitely worse. He was being tormented by a vast, impersonal system. The land itself, a passive and ancient recording device, had absorbed the echo of his agony, the crash, the hospital, his guilt, his grief. And the devil's jaw, powered by the raw energy of the blizzard, was amplifying that echo, broadcasting it back at him not as a memory, but as a weapon. The entity wasn't a spirit. It was a place. A cold, hungry, and terribly patient place. And it was using the memory of the person he loved most to feed. He had understood the how. The land was a recorder, the storm a power source, the mountain an amplifier. It was a machine of terrible, natural design. But in the hollow space where his own soul used to be, a new and far more dreadful question began to bloom like a black, carnivorous flower. Why? The truth crystallized in his mind, sharp and cold as a shard of ice. The frantic words of Hayes, the impossible. Voices, his own gut-wrenching reactions, they all pointed to one singular, horrific conclusion. This was not the work of a ghost. A ghost is an echo, a memory trapped in a loop, a tragedy replaying itself. A ghost is a sad, broken thing. The intelligence on the other end of the radio was not broken. It was patient, it was efficient, and it was intelligent. He was dealing with something ancient and non-human, a consciousness that had existed in this forest long before the first man ever set foot in it. It was not a spirit to be pitied or a demon to be exorcised. It was something far more primal. It was a predator. His mind, reeling, began to recontextualize the entire night's ordeal through this new, terrifying lens. The entity hadn't simply replayed his memories. It had selected them. It had curated them for maximum emotional impact. It hadn't just found the echo of Lily's voice. It had weaponized it, crafting the perfect, innocent plea designed to shatter the emotional armor he had spent 5 years building. It hadn't just broadcast the sounds of the crash. It had presented them as a prelude to the main act, the raw, screaming accusation from his wife, the one that would pour salt into the wound it had just ripped open. It wasn't just replaying tragedy. It was feeding on the emotions that the tragedy generated. His despair, his terror, his bottomless, soul-crushing guilt that was its nourishment. The voices of Lily and Sarah were not genuine echoes of the lost. They were lures. They were perfectly crafted bait cast into the deep, dark waters of his grief, designed to make him struggle, to make him feel. His agony was its meal. He was not a witness to a haunting. He was the livestock. And in that moment, the entire dynamic of his terror shifted. The semantics of it were critical, a fine distinction that changed everything. To be haunted is to be a victim of circumstance, to be tormented by a past that will not die. To be haunted is to be the target of something that is alive, and that wants something from you. Now, he was not being haunted, he was being hunted. The primal fear that had held him in its grip for hours did not vanish, but it was joined and then overlaid by a new and powerful emotion, a chilling, profound disgust. It was the revulsion one feels for a parasite, for a creature that sustains itself on the suffering of another. The entity had taken the most sacred, most painful, and most private moments of his life, his love for his daughter, the horror of her death, the guilt that was his alone to carry, and it had turned them into a food source. It was a defilement, a spiritual violation so deep it made his skin crawl. He looked at the radio, at the source of the voices. It was no longer a window into a supernatural mystery. It was the feeding maw of a predator. And Frank Miller, for the first time since the voice of his daughter had spoken, began to feel the cold, sharp edges of something other than fear. He began to feel anger. The anger was a new and unexpected flavor in the cold air of the cabin, sharp, brittle, and defiant. It was a shield, a wall of fire. Frank was frantically trying to build around the raw, wounded core of his grief. For a moment, it felt like it might hold. For a moment, he felt something other than the crushing weight of victimhood. The predator, sensing this subtle shift in its prey, changed its tactics once more. The replays, the broadcasts of the past had served their purpose. They had broken him open. Now, it was time for a more intimate, more direct form of feeding. It became interactive. The hollow silence in the cabin ended. The voice that returned was Lily's, but it was different now. It was softer, closer, imbued with a childlike curiosity that was 1,000 times more monstrous than Sarah's rage. "Daddy?" The voice whispered from the speaker, gentle and questioning. "Are you still there? I can't see you." A war raged within Frank, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles turning white. A guttural snarl formed in his throat. He wanted to scream at it, to tell this profane mimic to get out of his daughter's voice, to bellow with all the rage and disgust that was boiling inside him. But the sound was so perfect, so heartbreakingly real, that his anger was choked by a tidal wave of sorrow. To scream at that voice would feel like screaming at Lily herself. The voice, sensing his hesitation, continued its delicate, devastating work. That sound was so loud before. With the car, did it hurt Daddy? The question was a surgeon's scalpel, slipping past the shield of his anger and sliding directly into the wound. It forced him to relive it, not as a soundscape, but as a physical sensation. He could almost feel the phantom sting of shattered glass on his skin, the deep, bone-jarring ache of the impact. He shook his head, biting his lips so hard he tasted blood. "Don't," he rasped at the silent radio. "Were you scared?" The voice asked, with the same innocent, unwavering curiosity. "I think I was scared." "Stop it," Frank begged, his voice cracking. He knew it was a lure. He knew it was a trap, but the image of his daughter, frightened in her final moments, was a truth he could not bear. The entity had him. It had bypassed his anger and found the raw grief beneath. Now, it delivered the blow it had been setting up all along. "Do you miss me, Daddy?" The question shattered the last of his defenses. The anger, the disgust, the will to fight it all dissolved into a singular, overwhelming agony. A sob, thick and ragged, tore itself from his chest. Yes, he cried, the word a confession of his entire broken existence. God, Lily, yes. The entity, having received the emotional response it craved, twisted the knife, Mommy said it was your fault. The voice said, no longer curious, but with a note of simple, heartbreaking confusion. She said, you were supposed to keep me safe. Is that true, Daddy? Frank fell to his knees, the question hitting him with the force of a final, damning verdict. The entity had found the perfect weapon, his own love, turned back on him as an instrument of a real-time, interactive torture. He was no longer just listening to the past. He was being cross-examined by it, and the questions were designed to make him confess until his soul bled out. The question hung in the air of the cabin, a final, perfect trap from which there was no escape. Frank, weeping on the floor, gave no answer. He couldn't. To admit the truth of it to the voice of his own daughter would be to annihilate the last, shattered remnants of his own soul. The entity, sensing it had reached the core of his pain, now prepared to feed. The time for questions was over. It was time for the final demand. The voice of Lily softened, losing the edge of innocent confusion and taking on a tone of gentle, heartbreaking pleading. It was the voice a child uses when they are truly hurt, when they desperately need comfort and understanding from their father. It was the most potent weapon in its arsenal. Please, Daddy, the voice whispered, a sound of pure, unadulterated love. Don't be quiet. I need to understand. Frank squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head. No, tell me again, the voice pleaded, its sweetness a venom that paralyzed him. Tell me the whole story. I was there, but it was all so fast. I want to hear it from you. I need to hear it. Tell me what happened. The voice paused, letting the request sink in, before delivering the final, devastating blow. Tell me how you felt. And in that moment, the true nature of the entity's hunger was laid bare. This ancient, parasitic consciousness had no use for a human soul, not in the way the old myths described. It couldn't possess him, couldn't drag him to some fiery hell. Its needs were far more intimate and far more obscene. It didn't want his life. It didn't want his soul. It wanted his confession. It wanted his breakdown not as a byproduct of its torture, but as the goal itself. It wasn't enough for Frank to feel the agony. He had to articulate it. He had to take the formless, chaotic vortex of his grief and guilt and give it shape, structure, and narrative. He had to build a monument to his own despair, word by painstaking word, and offer it up as a sacrifice. His spoken pain, the performance of his sorrow, was the final, exquisite meal it had been preparing all night. Frank knelt on the floor, caught in the most terrible paradox of his existence. A part of him, the broken father, yearned to comply. The voice of his daughter was asking him to unburden himself, to finally speak the truth he had kept locked away for 5 years. There was a perverse, seductive promise of release in the demand, a chance to confess to the only person who mattered. But the other part of him, the man who now understood he was prey, knew the truth. To speak was to feed the monster. To tell the story was to willingly serve his heart on a platter for the ancient, hungry intelligence that was wearing his daughter's face. The ultimatum had been issued. The entity waited patiently, listening in the dark, and Frank, trapped between his need for absolution and his will to survive, began to break apart. He was on the precipice, kneeling on the floor of the cabin, his soul laid bare, the story of his failure ready to spill from his lips. The pleading voice of his daughter was a siren song, promising a strange, sweet release in the act of confession. He opened his mouth to speak, to give the entity the feast it craved, and then something inside him broke. Or perhaps something was forged. In the deepest pit of his despair, a moment of desperate, terrible clarity ignited. It was the instinct of the prey that finally sees the hunter's trap not as a place of rest, but as a place of death. He looked at the radio, and for the first time, he did not hear his daughter's voice. He heard the perfect mimicry of a predator. He saw the plea for his story not as a request for comfort, but as a demand for his essence. He understood, with a clarity that cut through the fog of his grief like a bolt of lightning, that his pain was not just his burden, it was its weapon. His sorrow was not just his to bear, it was its nourishment. Every tear he shed, every sob that tore from his throat, every word of guilt he was about to speak was a banquet for the thing on the other end of the frequency. And in that moment of pure, undiluted understanding, he decided to starve it. Slowly, with the deliberate movements of a man remaking himself, he pushed himself up from the floor. He was no longer the weeping, broken father. He wiped the tears from his face with the back of his hand. His gesture not one of sorrow, but of cold, hard fury. He walked back to the chair and sat down, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the radio speaker. He built a fortress inside his mind, bricked it with the memory of the real Lily, and sealed the gate. The voice from the radio, sensing the change, the sudden denial of his expected meal, became more urgent. "Daddy, why won't you talk to me? Please, I'm scared." Frank said nothing. He focused on his breathing, in and out, a slow, steady rhythm. He was a stone. He was a wall of ice. "Did I do something wrong?" the voice asked, a tremor of a child's panic entering its perfect tone. "Are you mad at me?" He remained silent. He could feel the entity probing, searching for a crack in his resolve. When the pleading failed, it moved to its most powerful weapon. The voice began to cry. It was not a simple sniffle, but a torrent of heart-wrenching, soul-tearing sobs that filled the cabin. It was the sound of a small child, lost and terrified and in terrible pain. It was the sound designed by nature to break a father's heart. Every paternal instinct in Frank's body screamed at him to answer, to comfort, to soothe the sound of that terrible weeping. But he held fast. He pictured the entity, the ancient, hungry intelligence, and knew that every sob was a lie. He gave it nothing, not a word, not a gasp, not a single tear. He sat in his chair, a statue carved from grief and fury, and let the ghost of his daughter weep unanswered in the dark. The weeping from the radio faltered, then subsided, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. The entity had played its strongest card and failed. It was waiting, listening, its patience as vast and as cold as the forest itself. In the moments before, Frank's silence had been a shield. Now, sitting upright in the chair, a new resolve hardening in his chest, he decided it was time to forge a sword. He would not give the creature the satisfaction of his fear. He would not give it the nourishment of his pain. But he would not remain silent either. To be silent was to let the entity control the narrative, to let its profane mimicry be the last word spoken into the darkness. He was going to take the airwaves back. With a hand that was now perfectly steady, he reached forward and picked up the microphone. His thumb rested on the transmit button. He took one deep, ragged breath, held it for a moment, and then pressed down. The click of the transmitter engaging echoed in the cabin. The entity was listening, but Frank did not look at the radio. He did not speak to the thing that wore his daughter's voice. He closed his eyes, shutting out the grim, flickering light of the cabin, and looked inward. He spoke directly into the past, across the years of grief, to the pure and untainted memory of the little girl with paint on her fingers, and a smile that outshone the Sunday lily. He said, his voice quiet but clear and strong, resonating with an authority that had been absent for 5 long years. "Sweetie, if you can hear me, the real you, I need to say something." He paused, gathering his strength. He could feel the predatory intelligence on the other end, listening, waiting for the confession, for the story, for the meal. Frank denied it. "I'm sorry," he said, the words simple, clean, and stripped of the frantic guilt the entity had tried to provoke. "The accident, it was my fault. I was driving, and I have been sorry for every single second of every single day since. I'm so sorry." He let the apology settle in the air, a clean and honest admission offered freely, not torn from him under duress. "But that's not what I wanted to tell you," he continued, his voice softening. "I wanted to tell you that I love you. I loved you more than the sky, sweetie, more than anything. That part of me is the one thing that's real. The one thing this thing can't ever touch. It can steal your voice, but it can't have my love. He thought of the music box, of the entity twisting its melody into a dirge. He would reclaim it. That song, that was our song, and it was beautiful. And I will never ever forget it. I will never forget you. It was his final, ultimate act of defiance. He refused to give the monster the feast of his pain. Instead, he offered the memory of his daughter, the sacrament of his love. He was using the entity's own weapon against it, filling the frequency not with the negative, chaotic energy it craved, but with the one emotion it could not comprehend and could not consume. He released the button, and the microphone fell silent. He had delivered his final broadcast. For a long, breathless moment, there was only silence, a true silence. Frank had said his piece, had planted his flag of love and memory in the heart of the entity's territory, and it seemed to have no reply. The rhythmic, breathing static had faltered, sputtering and stopping, as if the creature had choked on the purity of his defiance. He had offered it love, and it had recoiled. It felt like a victory, but the recoil was only for a moment. A predator, when wounded or confused, does not retreat, it attacks. A low-frequency hum began to emanate from the destroyed speaker, a sound so deep it vibrated in Frank's bones, shaking the coffee mug on the counter. The hum grew rapidly in pitch and volume, escalating into a piercing, unbearable shriek. It was a sound of pure, psychopathic fury. It was a cacophony of the entire night compressed into a single, deafening roar, the screech of tires, the scream of his wife, the demented lullaby, all layered into one inhuman wave of sonic violence. The two low-wattage emergency bulbs on the walls flickered wildly, and then, with a sharp, percussive pop, they burst, showering the cabin in a brief cascade of glass. Frank was plunged into near-total darkness, the only light now coming from the malevolent green glow of the radio's frequency display. And in that roaring darkness, Frank's purpose became diamond hard. He knew with absolute certainty that he could not kill it. How do you kill a forest? How do you kill the memory of the land itself? It was ancient and vast, and he was just a man, but he could make it mute. He could cut out its tongue. His eyes were locked on the glowing green display of the radio console, the mouthpiece, the conduit, the mouth. A roar tore itself from Frank's own throat, a sound of pure, primal grief and unrestrained rage. It was the sound of a father's love and a survivor's fury, and it rose to meet the shriek of the entity. He lunged across the room, his hands closing around the worn wooden handle of the fire axe mounted on the wall. The cold, heavy weight of the steel head felt like an extension of his own will. He turned, the green light glinting off the polished blade, and brought the axe down. The first blow was for Lily. It struck the console with a deafening crack, shattering the plastic casing and sending a shower of sparks into the dark. The entity's shriek faltered, turning into a high-pitched squeal of electronic agony. The second blow was for Sarah. The axe bit deeper, crunching through vacuum tubes and splintering circuit boards. The green light flickered and died. The third blow was for himself. He brought it down again and again and again, a wild, sobbing engine of destruction. He was not just destroying a machine, he was annihilating the instrument of his torture, the altar of his pain. With each brutal, percussive impact, he was taking back the silence, taking back his daughter's memory, taking back his own sanity. The electronic squeal died with a final, pathetic whimper, and the only sounds left were the roar of the storm outside and the ragged, gasping breaths of Frank Miller, standing victorious in the wreckage. On the audio log recovered from the station's hard drive, this is where the narrative of a human voice ends, and a far more ambiguous story, told only in sound and silence, begins. The recording captures the final, violent moments of Frank Miller's confrontation with perfect, terrifying fidelity. First, there is the sound of his own primal roar, a guttural cry of pure rage and grief that is abruptly joined by the brutal, percussive impacts of the fire axe. The microphone, located near the console, registers every blow with distorted clarity. There is the sharp, resonant crack of splintering wood as the axe bites into the desk. There is the brittle, crystalline crunch of electronics being pulverized, of vacuum tubes imploding, and circuit boards snapping in two. Underneath the violence, the recording captures the sound of Frank's breathing. It is no longer the slow, controlled breath of his defiance, but the ragged, desperate gasps of a man pushing his body past its absolute limit. It is the sound of every ounce of his remaining strength being poured into this one final act of destruction. The electronic shriek of the entity dies mid-wail, cut off as the axe finds its heart. For a few seconds, the only sounds are Frank's harsh breathing and the thud of the axe continuing its work. And then, there is a new sound. It is not the axe. It is a final, deafening crash that peaks the microphone, turning the last second of the event into a burst of pure, unintelligible noise. It is a sound of immense weight and force, of wood splintering on a massive scale, followed by the distinct, musical cascade of a large pane of glass shattering. It is the sound of the outside world, the storm itself finally breaking into the small, fragile shelter. And then, silence. It is not the tense, waiting silence of the entity, nor the heavy, grief-stricken silence from before. This is a profound and empty silence, a silence that feels final. On the audio log, Frank's ragged breathing is gone, the impacts of the axe are gone, every sound of human struggle has ceased. The only thing the microphone picks up now is a low, mournful, and continuous sound, the whistling of the wind. It is no longer a muffled roar from outside. It is the clear, crisp sound of the blizzard blowing through the cabin, a sign that the barrier between the man and the wilderness has been irrevocably breached. It is the sound of an empty room. For many long, silent minutes, the only sound on the recovered recording is the lonely whistling of the wind. The story told by Frank Miller's voice is over. What is left is the story told by the scene he left behind, the one that greeted the members of Rescue Team Bravo 3 days later. The cabin was a frozen tomb. The source of the final, deafening crash on the audio log was immediately obvious. The main window overlooking the gorge had been completely shattered, its frame splintered inwards. A fine, glittering layer of snow, blown in by the storm, dusted the floor and the furniture. A quiet and persistent invasion of the wilderness into the domain of men. The cold was absolute, a physical presence that seemed to have leached all the life from the room. At the center of it all was the desk. It was a scene of focused, savage violence. The radio console was not merely broken, it was annihilated. It was a grave of wires, shattered plastic, and pulverized vacuum tubes. The fire axe lay beside the wreckage, its blade clean, as if laid to rest after its work was done. This was where Frank had made his last stand. The rescue team, methodical and professional, began their search. They searched for a body, they found none. They searched for signs of a struggle with an intruder, human or animal. They found none. There was no blood, no overturned furniture, no indication of any violence other than that which had been directed at the radio. Most unnervingly, they searched for a way out. The door was still bolted from the inside. The only breach was a shattered window. But when they examined the deep, pristine snowdrifts outside, their powerful flashlights scanning every inch of the unbroken blanket of white, they found nothing. No footprints leading away from the cabin. No drag marks, no trace that anything or anyone had exited the station since the blizzard began. It was an impossible, maddening puzzle. A man cannot simply vanish from a locked room, and yet the evidence was irrefutable. Frank Miller was gone. He had not been dragged away. He had not fled into the storm. He had simply ceased to be. The rescue team, in their official report, would list his status as missing, presumed deceased, citing the blizzard as the likely cause. But the truth that hung in the frozen air of that cabin was far colder and more terrible. Standing over the wreckage of the silenced radio, one could not escape the final, chilling conclusion. The prize for destroying the mouthpiece was the man who held the axe. The cause for silencing the voice from the void was his own existence. Captain Mark Harris of the State Park Service Search and Rescue had seen, in his 25 years of service, nearly every form of tragedy the wilderness could devise. He had seen hikers, delirious with hypothermia, walk off the edges of cliffs. He had seen the aftermath of grisly attacks, of avalanches, of campers who had made one small fatal mistake with a faulty heater. He had seen death by starvation, by dehydration, and by simple, profound loneliness. He was a man accustomed to piecing together the final, desperate stories of the lost from the grim evidence they left behind. He was a man not easily shaken, but as he stood in the frozen, silent wreckage of Ranger Station Delta 3 days after the blizzard had broken, he felt a deep and profound unease. It was a feeling that went beyond the usual somber respect for the dead. It was a cold, crawling sensation in his gut that told him something was fundamentally wrong. His experienced eyes scanned the scene, but his brain struggled to assemble a coherent narrative. The violence was the first anomaly. He looked at the pulverized radio console, the fire axe resting beside it. This wasn't the work of a man who had lost his mind. This was the work of a man who had declared war on a machine. Then there was the window, its frame shattered, the snow drifting in. Storm damage? Possibly. But the main supports were splintered inwards, as if from a single, massive blow from the outside. A blow that had left no other trace. And that was the deepest violation of all, the lack of traces. Harris had personally led the perimeter search himself. The snow outside was a perfect, silent witness. A pristine blanket 4 feet deep in every direction. It testified to an impossible crime. A man had been erased from a sealed room. In his world, people always left a mark, a footprint, a bloodstain, a dropped glove. Frank Miller had left nothing. Harris had spent his life operating within the firm, reliable laws of nature. Gravity pulled you down, cold froze you, starvation weakened you, and people left tracks. These were the fundamental rules of his universe. But this small, frozen cabin felt like a place where those rules had been suspended. It felt like a tear in the fabric of reality, a pocket of impossibility where the normal physics of the world no longer applied. It wasn't a feeling of being in a haunted place. He'd heard ghost stories from other rangers his whole career and had never believed a one. This was different. This was a feeling that the very logic of the world he knew had been bent and broken in this room. It was the cold, intellectual terror of an expert encountering a problem with no rational solution. The scene did not feel tragic. It felt wrong. The command center was a world away from the impossible silence of Station Delta. Here, in the warm, brightly lit room, the universe felt solid and rational again. It was a place of order, governed by the low hum of servers, the crackle of a dozen routine radio channels, and the reassuring aroma of hot coffee. It was a place where maps had clear coordinates, where procedures were followed, and where every tragedy eventually had an explanation. It took Ben, Harris's lead technician, the better part of a day to salvage the audio files from the station's battered hard drive. Now, with the storm past and the initial search concluded, the two of them sat in the quiet of the comms room, a pair of high-quality speakers ready to play back the final hours of Frank Miller's life. "Ready, Cap?" Ben asked, his hand hovering over the mouse. Harris nodded grimly. "Play it." The recording began, and for the first hour, it was exactly what Harris expected. They heard the voice of a consummate professional. Frank's calm, methodical reports on the weather, his steady tone, the by-the-book procedure, it was all perfectly normal. "That's the Frank I knew," Harris murmured, leaning back in his chair. Then they heard the shift. They heard the long, weary silences. They heard him pull out the music box, the teeny, off-key lullaby, sounding fragile and sad in the high-fidelity speakers. "Heard he lost his daughter in a car wreck a few years back," Ben said quietly, his eyes on the audio waveform on his screen. "Tough posting for a guy carrying that kind of weight." Harris just nodded, a knot tightening in his stomach. He knew where this was going. He'd seen it before. Isolation is a powerful acid. Add grief to the mix, and it can dissolve a man's mind. They listened as Frank described the rhythmic static, Ben muttering about atmospheric interference from the storm. They heard him discover the logbook and read Hayes' frantic entries. Paranoid transference, Ben diagnosed quietly. He's projecting his own anxiety onto the words of a guy who probably had his own breakdown. Then came the voices. They listened, both men sitting in stunned silence, as the radio broadcast the impossible sounds of the crash, the raw, screaming grief of Frank's ex-wife, and finally, the crystal-clear voice of his dead daughter. Ben shook his head slowly, a look of profound pity on his face. "God, the poor bastard," he whispered. Complete psychotic break. Auditory hallucinations brought on by stress and trauma. He wasn't just hearing things. He was reliving his own personal hell. It was the only explanation that made sense. It was logical. It was tragic. A man, broken by a past he couldn't escape, is sent to the most isolated place on earth during a record-breaking storm. His mind, unable to cope, simply shatters. It was a story Harris had seen variations of his entire career, and yet, he couldn't shake the feeling from the cabin, the feeling of wrongness, the focused, surgical destruction of the radio, the pristine, unbroken snow. The story on the tape was one of a man's mind imploding inward in chaos. The evidence at the scene was of a man erased by a force of impossible external order. The two narratives did not fit, and as the final, violent moments of the recording began to play, Harris leaned forward, his gut telling him that the simple, tragic story of Frank Miller's madness was not the whole truth. They listened to the final moments on the recording, the story reaching its violent, tragic crescendo. They heard Frank's defiant, loving speech, a broadcast that, to Harris, sounded less like the ramblings of a madman and more like a soldier's last, desperate prayer. They heard the entity's inhuman roar of fury, a sound that made the coffee in Ben's mug ripple. They heard the brutal impacts of the axe, and the final, catastrophic crash that ended with the lonely sound of the wind. The speakers fell silent. The audio file had reached its end. In the warm, well-lit command center, the only sound was the low hum of the servers. Ben let out a long, low whistle. Jesus, he really went off the deep end. He began typing, preparing to label and archive the files. In his mind, the case was closed. A tragic but understandable breakdown. Harris said nothing. He stared at the silent speakers, the profound sense of wrongness from the cabin settling over him once more. The easy explanation felt like a lie, a comfortable story told to keep a far more terrible truth at bay. "That's weird," Ben said suddenly, frowning at his diagnostic screen. "What is?" Harris asked, his voice sharp. "I'm getting a faint signal bleed on our own channel, right here, on the main SAR frequency." Ben pointed to a thin, erratic line on his spectrum analyzer. A low-power carrier wave. It shouldn't be there. Probably just some skip from a distant station. A cold prickle of dread traced its way down Harris's spine. "What kind of signal?" "Dunno. Let's see what we've got." Ben's fingers danced across his keyboard, isolating the phantom signal. "I'll run it through the main amplifier. We can probably identify the source and log a complaint." He clicked his mouse. A faint, metallic whispering emerged from the speakers. It was thin and barely audible. "Come on, you little ghost," Ben muttered, adjusting the filters, cleaning up the sound. "Let's hear you." The whispering grew clearer. Harris leaned forward, his heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He recognized it. Not the notes, not at first, but the feeling of it. The sickly, corrupted quality of the sound. His face went pale, and then the melody resolved. Faint, but perfectly clear. The teeny, warped, and demented notes of "Hush, Little Baby" trickled into the secure, rational space of the command center. It was no longer a recording. It was life. The wrongness of the cabin had not stayed behind in the woods. It had followed them. It had attached itself to the story, to the recording, and it was now bleeding into their world. It was here. Ben stared at the speakers, a confused frown on his face. What the hell is that? Sounds like an old ice cream truck. But Harris was no longer listening to him. The blood in his veins had turned to ice. A primal, reptilian fear, deeper than anything he had ever felt in the wilderness, seized him. All his training, all his experience, all the rules of his well-ordered world were consumed by a singular, terrifying truth. The thing from the woods had a new antenna. "Shut it off," Harris whispered, his voice a choked, strangled thing. Ben looked at him, confused. "Cap?" Harris' control finally shattered. He lunged across the console, his eyes wide with a terror that was absolute. "Shut it off," he screamed, his voice a raw, ragged shriek of a man who had just understood that the story was not over. "Shut it off now." Ben, reacting more to the raw, animal panic in his captain's voice than to the faint, strange melody, slammed his palm down on the main power switch for the audio console. The speakers gave a final, sharp click. The lullaby vanished. The command center was plunged into a sudden, shocking silence, broken only by the low hum of the servers and the sound of Captain Harris's ragged, desperate breathing. The two men were left in the quiet, sterile room, staring at the dead speakers. The immediate threat was gone, but the knowledge of it, the terrible truth of it, now hung between them, a poison in the air. And this is where the story, as it was recorded, ends. But it is not a resolution. It is a contagion. In his final, violent moments, standing alone in the roaring darkness, Frank Miller accomplished something extraordinary. Armed with nothing but a fire axe and the ferocious, defiant power of a father's love, he did what he set out to do. He destroyed the mouthpiece. He cut out the tongue of the monster. He severed the connection between the ancient, parasitic consciousness of the devil's jaw and its lonely antenna at Station Delta. He won his battle. But a signal, once broadcast, seeks a receiver. A story, once told, seeks a listener. And a hunger, once awakened, seeks a new way to feed. The members of Rescue Team Bravo, in their diligence, in their simple, human need to understand the fate of a fallen colleague, had brought the story back with them. They had carried the recording, the digital ghost, from the heart of the ancient forest into the heart of their own modern world. By listening to the tape, they had not just reviewed evidence, they had tuned their own sophisticated equipment to a frequency that should never have been found. Frank Miller had destroyed a single, isolated, storm-battered antenna, but in the state-of-the-art command center, with its powerful transmitters and receivers capable of reaching every corner of the state, every other ranger station, every emergency service channel, they had just provided the entity with a new one, a better one. The story of Frank Miller is over. His screams are silent. But the silence that fell over the command center is a far more terrifying sound. It is the silence of a new channel, opened and waiting. The ancient hunger is broadcasting again.